Mafia love trap, sold to him, yet I became his salvation. Her scream cut through the room like a blade. The auctioneer's hammer slammed down. Sold, just like that. Sofia stood trembling under the harsh spotlight, wrists bound in delicate silk that mocked the brutality of the moment. Men in suits whispered in the shadows, their eyes glinting with greed and hunger. And then he appeared. Tall, silent, dangerous. The one they called Lorenzo DeLuca. The man whose name made both police chiefs and killers step aside. He didn't bid. He simply stood, arms crossed, and everyone fell silent. The auctioneer's voice cracked as he stuttered his name, declaring that the lot was sold to him. Sofia's breath hitched. She wasn't sold to a man. She was delivered to a legend. Hey, before we go deeper into this fire, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Don't forget to hit subscribe because what's coming next will leave your jaw on the floor. Trust me, you don't want to miss what this man does next. Lorenzo didn't look at her when the guards released her restraints. He just turned and walked out, expecting her to follow. She stumbled after him, her bare feet echoing against the marble floor. Outside, black cars waited, engines humming like beasts. The door opened for her, and as she slid inside, the air inside felt heavy, leather, smoke, and danger. She tried to speak, but Lorenzo's cold voice silenced her. He said nothing more than one sentence. Calm, but sharp as a knife. She belonged to him now. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming, her dignity clawing for air. But in that same moment, a strange flicker of something she didn't understand sparked deep inside her. Fear or fate. The ride to his mansion was endless. The city blurred by in streaks of light, but all she could see was his reflection in the tinted glass. The way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers tapped on his knee like he was fighting something inside him. When they arrived, the gates opened without a sound. Guard bowed. The power around him was suffocating, but it wasn't loud. It was controlled, disciplined, like the calm before a storm. Inside, she was led to a room, not locked but guarded. It was beautiful, almost cruelly so. She wanted to scream, to demand why he'd bought her. But she stayed silent, watching him stand by the window, cigarette smoke curling around his face. He turned, finally meeting her eyes. There was no lust in his gaze, no amusement, just something broken, buried deep behind his expression. He asked her name, and when she whispered Sofia, his lips barely moved as he repeated it, like testing the sound of it against his tongue. He told her she was safe here, but the way he said it made her heart twist. Safe? From what? Or from whom? When he left, the silence that followed was worse than fear itself. She sat on the edge of the bed, shaking, not from cold, but from confusion. Days passed like blurred dreams. No one touched her. No one hurt her. Lorenzo never returned to her room, but his shadow lingered everywhere. She saw him sometimes from afar, on phone calls in the courtyard with men in suits, his voice steady, commanding. Rumors spread among the staff that she was special, that he'd never brought anyone to his home before. Some whispered she was bait, others said she was leverage. She didn't know which terrified her more. Then came the first crack in his armor. One night, she heard shouting from downstairs. Gunshots followed. She hid behind the curtain, clutching her trembling hands to her chest. When the door burst open, Lorenzo stumbled in, blood on his sleeve. He saw her and froze, his mask of control faltering for the first time. She wanted to run, but something inside her pulled her closer. Without thinking, she grabbed a towel, pressed it to his wound. He tried to push her away, but she didn't listen. Her hands were shaking, her breath fast, yet her voice steady as she told him to sit down. He looked at her like he'd never seen a human being before. Only enemies, only threats, and for the first time, he saw someone choosing him, not fearing him. After that night, something changed. He started speaking to her, short sentences, quiet questions. He asked about her past, her family, the life she'd been taken from. She told him she was a waitress before her debts caught up to her. Debts she didn't even owe. Someone had set her up. He didn't react, but the next day, the man who'd sold her disappeared from the city. No one spoke about it, but everyone knew who was behind it. Sofia saw the darkness around him, the violence he commanded with a glance. Yet beneath it, there was a man fighting ghosts no one else could see. She started to understand that the monster people feared was also a man who hadn't been shown mercy in years. And in her silence, her patience, something inside him began to thaw. He started sitting near her during meals. He didn't touch her. He didn't demand anything. He just sat. Sometimes he'd watch her read. Sometimes he'd listen to her hum softly when she thought she was alone. He once told her that her voice made the walls less heavy. But the world he ruled wasn't built to feel. It was built to destroy. The day his rivals discovered her existence, everything changed. One of his men betrayed him, leaking her name, her location. The warning came too late. The mansion lights went out. Sofia was dragged from her room by masked men, her screams muffled by rough hands. Lorenzo's roar echoed through the darkness, furious and raw. The air exploded with gunfire. She caught one last glimpse of him, his eyes burning like a storm, as the world tilted and she was pulled into the night. She thought she'd die that night, thought she'd vanish like all the other lost girls the world forgot. But somewhere in the chaos, she heard it, his voice sharp, commanding, breaking through the smoke. And then silence. When she woke, her wrists were free, her body shaking. He was sitting beside her, covered in blood, breathing hard but alive. His first words to her weren't orders. They were a whisper. He said she wasn't just something he bought. She was the reason he was still human. And as he reached for her trembling hand, the girl who'd been sold realized she'd been found instead. But neither of them knew the war that saving her had just begun. Sofia didn't sleep that night. The echo of gunfire still lived in her bones. She sat upright on the edge of the bed, watching the faint flicker of light from the hallway. Lorenzo was in the next room, pacing like a lion trapped inside his own cage. Every few seconds, she heard the clink of ice in a glass, the rasp of his breath, the quiet hum of his anger trying to swallow itself. When he finally stepped into her doorway, the moonlight carved his face into something half human, half ghost. His shirt was still stained with blood, not all of it his. She should have looked away. She didn't. He told her to pack her things, his voice low, rough, like gravel dragged over steel. She asked where they were going. He said somewhere safer. His jaw flexed, and for the first time, she realized how much he feared losing control, not of the world, but of himself. The car ride out of the city was silent except for the sound of tires slicing through rain. She watched the skyline disappear, towers swallowed by fog. Lorenzo sat beside her, his hand resting against his thigh, fingers twitching slightly. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words stayed buried under all that armor. When they reached the edge of the countryside, a small cabin appeared, lights flickering weakly through the storm. It was the first place she'd seen that didn't reek of luxury or danger. It looked like somewhere a person could breathe. He told her it was one of his safe houses, then walked off into the rain without waiting for her reply. Inside, she found a towel and sat by the small fireplace, the heat thawing the chill in her bones. When he returned, drenched, he didn't say a word, just sat across from her, staring into the fire like it was the only thing still alive inside him. The silence was heavy, but not empty. She could feel something shifting, like the world outside was waiting for one of them to speak first. When she finally whispered his name, he flinched like it hurt to hear it. She told him thank you. 2 small words, fragile but real. He didn't look up, but his voice cracked when he told her she didn't owe him anything. The next morning, she found him outside, cleaning his gun on the porch. His movements were slow, deliberate. He wasn't preparing for war. He was trying to keep his hands from shaking. He asked her if she was afraid of him. She didn't lie. She said yes. But she also told him she didn't think he wanted her to be. He froze, his eyes meeting hers, something raw flickering there before he looked away. Then he said something that didn't fit the man the world feared. He said fear kept him alive, but he was tired of living that way. Days turned into weeks. The storm passed, but the tension didn't. Sofia cooked, cleaned, moved quietly through the house. Lorenzo came and went at odd hours, sometimes vanishing for a day, returning with bruises and blood that weren't his own. She stopped asking. But one night, he returned looking different, calmer, lighter somehow. He told her he'd burned the accounts, cut ties with the men who'd started the attack. His own organization had turned on him, and instead of retaliating, he'd walked away. She didn't understand why. He told her he was done being a monster. That night, he asked her to sit with him by the fire again. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. He told her about his childhood in Sicily, how he'd been forced into the family business, how loyalty was taught through pain. He said love was weakness there, and that was why he never allowed himself to feel it. She told him weakness wasn't what she saw when she looked at him. She said maybe love was the only thing that made him human again. He didn't answer, but his silence said everything. In the weeks that followed, Lorenzo began to change. The men who visited the cabin started calling him boss less often and sir more respectfully. He stopped giving orders and started listening. And when Sofia laughed, really laughed for the first time, he turned to look at her like it was something holy. The world around them was still dangerous, but inside that small space, something fragile and real began to grow. Then one night, the past found them again. Lorenzo had gone to meet a contact in town, leaving Sofia with one of his trusted guards. Hours passed. Midnight came. He didn't return. The guard started pacing, hand on his gun, tension crawling up his neck. When Sofia asked what was wrong, he told her someone had tipped their location. Before she could react, headlights flashed outside. Cars. Too many. The guard shoved her toward the back door, yelling for her to run. But she didn't. She froze, her heart pounding, remembering the last time she'd been dragged away by strangers. The front door exploded inward. Men flooded the cabin, masked, armed, shouting orders. The guard fell first, gunfire echoing off the walls. Sofia ducked behind the table, covering her head, but a rough hand grabbed her, pulling her to her feet. She screamed, struggling, kicking, biting. The man cursed and slammed her against the wall. Then everything stopped. A single gunshot thundered through the room. The man holding her dropped, blood splattering her arm. Standing in the doorway, smoke curling from his gun, was Lorenzo. He moved like lightning, cold, silent, ruthless. Every motion precise, every shot lethal. When it was over, 5 men lay still, and the air reeked of smoke and gunpowder. Sofia stood shaking, unable to breathe. Lorenzo dropped the gun and rushed to her, grabbing her face, eyes wild, voice breaking. He told her he'd thought he'd lost her again. She touched his cheek, smearing blood across his skin, whispering that he hadn't. For the first time, he pulled her into his arms, holding her like the world outside didn't exist. His body trembled, not from rage, but from relief. That night, he didn't let go. He sat beside her until dawn, watching her sleep. When she woke, she found him staring out the window, the sunrise painting his face in golden shadows. He told her they couldn't stay here anymore. He was done running, done hiding. He said he'd end this life once and for all, but he needed her to promise something. If he didn't come back, she had to leave, start over, live free. She shook her head, tears spilling. He smiled, a real, human smile, and told her that was the first time someone had ever refused to leave him behind. Before he left, she caught his hand, told him she didn't care what the world thought he was, because she knew what he'd become. He didn't answer, but his fingers tightened around hers for a heartbeat before slipping away. As his car disappeared into the horizon, Sofia stood there, her heart heavy but fierce. She knew something had changed forever. The man who'd bought her life had now traded his own for it. And somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war that would decide who Lorenzo DeLuca truly was. The day Lorenzo left, Sofia felt something inside her collapse. She stood by the window long after his taillights vanished, her chest tight, her hands trembling with a fear she couldn't name. The cabin felt hollow without his presence, like the silence itself was waiting to break. Every sound made her jump, the groan of the floorboards, the wind scraping against the glass, the whisper of her own breath reminding her she was still there. She tried to keep busy, cleaning the same dishes over and over, folding the same blanket, just to stop herself from thinking about where he might be or who he might be facing. But no matter how hard she tried, his last words echoed in her mind. If I don't come back, live free. 3 days passed. No call, no message, nothing but the cold weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. She barely slept, and when she did, she saw him, bleeding, broken, reaching out but never quite touching her. On the 4th night, headlights swept across the window again. Her heart leapt, hope clawing its way to the surface. She ran to the door, yanked it open, and froze. It wasn't Lorenzo. 2 black SUVs sat in the rain, engines rumbling like beasts. Men stepped out, dressed in dark suits, their faces unreadable. One of them called her by name, his voice smooth but sharp like glass. He said Lorenzo had sent for her. She wanted to believe it, but something in his tone, something too calm, made her hesitate. When she refused to move, one of them stepped forward and grabbed her arm. Instinct kicked in. She twisted, elbowed him hard, grabbed a lamp from the table, and swung. The man went down with a curse. The others lunged. She bolted for the back door, bare feet hitting the cold mud outside. Rain soaked her hair, blurred her vision. A gunshot cracked through the night. She ducked behind a tree, heart hammering so loud it drowned out the storm. They were shouting now, spreading out. She ran, through the woods, through branches tearing at her clothes, through fear that burned hotter than pain. She didn't know how long she ran before she stumbled onto the old road. A single pair of headlights appeared in the distance. She waved her arms, desperate. The car slowed, and for a heartbeat she thought it might be him. But when the window rolled down, the driver's face wasn't Lorenzo's. It was Matteo, the one man Lorenzo had once called brother before betrayal split them apart. He smiled, that cruel, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told her to get in. She hesitated, but she was surrounded. Black cars emerged behind her, engines rumbling like thunder. She had no choice. Inside the car, Matteo's cologne was heavy, suffocating. He drove in silence for a while, occasionally glancing at her with a kind of amusement that made her skin crawl. Finally, he spoke, saying Lorenzo should have known better than to fall for a girl he'd bought. His words hit her like a slap. She demanded to know where Lorenzo was, but Matteo just laughed, saying Lorenzo had walked straight into his trap. He said love made even the strongest men weak, and that weakness was what destroyed them in the end. By the time they reached the city, dawn had begun to bleed through the clouds. He led her into a high-rise building guarded by men with guns, their eyes cold and detached. He pushed her into a room and locked the door. For hours she paced, trying to think, trying not to imagine what they might be doing to Lorenzo. She found a shard of glass near the window and kept it hidden, gripping it tight. When the door opened again, Matteo walked in, holding Lorenzo's ring between his fingers. Her stomach twisted. He dropped on the floor and said Lorenzo wasn't dead yet, but if she wanted him alive, she'd have to help. He told her there was a deal on the table, one that could save Lorenzo's life but cost everything else. Lorenzo's men were scattered, leaderless, some ready to switch sides. Matteo wanted her to deliver a message, to convince Lorenzo to surrender, to make him believe she'd betrayed him. Her throat tightened. Matteo said if she refused, Lorenzo would bleed out slowly somewhere no one would find him. She stared at the ring on the floor, her pulse racing. She'd seen what Matteo was capable of. She knew he wasn't bluffing. When she finally spoke, her voice shook, but she said she'd do it. Matteo smirked, called her the perfect pawn, and handed her a phone. The call connected before she could breathe. Lorenzo's voice came through the line, hoarse, strained, but alive. He asked where she was, told her to stay put, said he was coming for her. She wanted to tell him the truth, to scream that it was a trap, but Matteo's gun was pressed against her ribs. So she said what Matteo wanted her to say, that she couldn't do this anymore, that she'd made a deal. The silence that followed was worse than death. Then the line went dead. Matteo looked pleased. He told her Lorenzo would walk right into his hands, that love always made fools of men. She waited until he turned his back. Then she moved. The shard of glass flashed, slicing his arm. He roared, spinning around, but she was already bolting out the door. The alarm blared through the building. She sprinted down the hall, grabbed a fallen guard's gun, and fired at the cameras. Bullets tore through the air. She didn't stop. Down the stairs, through the lobby, into the street, sirens wailing somewhere in the distance. She jumped into a parked car, hot-wired it with shaking hands, and drove until the city lights faded behind her. Her mind raced. If Lorenzo thought she'd betrayed him, he wouldn't trust her. But she couldn't let him walk into that trap. She remembered the safe house near the coast, the one he'd once mentioned if everything went wrong. That's where she headed, praying he'd go there too. The drive was endless. Her eyes burned, her body ached, but she didn't stop. When she finally reached the coastline, the sun was setting, painting the water in fire. The cabin stood alone on the cliff, quiet, waiting. She stepped inside, gun still in her trembling hand. Then she froze. Lorenzo was there, leaning against the wall, bruised, bloodied, eyes dark with fury. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he spoke, his voice low, dangerous, asking if she'd come to finish what she started. She tried to explain, but he cut her off, saying Matteo had sent men after him because of that call. He'd barely made it out alive. He said he'd killed 3 of them before realizing her voice on the line was the only thing that kept him moving. Tears filled her eyes as she told him everything. The threats, the gun, the lie she'd been forced to tell. He didn't move, didn't blink. For a second, she thought he'd shoot her. Then he dropped the gun and pulled her into him, his breath shaking against her neck. He said he believed her because he wanted to. Because even when the whole world turned against him, she was the one thing he couldn't let go of. But before they could breathe, a flash of light cut across the window. Headlights. Matteo's cars. Dozens of them. The roar of engines filled the night. Lorenzo pulled away, eyes burning with a fury that looked almost holy. He told her to stay behind him. She shook her head, grabbed his spare gun, and said she wasn't leaving this time. The air outside crackled with tension, thunder rolling over the sea. Matteo stepped out of the lead car, his arm bandaged, his smile cruel. He shouted that this was the end, that love had turned them both into targets. Lorenzo raised his gun, his voice steady, telling him he was right. Love had changed everything, because it had turned a monster into a man with something worth dying for. And as the first shot shattered the night, Sofia didn't flinch. She fired back, her heart pounding with a fire she'd never known before. The trap that once caught her had become her battleground, and this time, she wasn't the one being sold. She was the one fighting for freedom. The night exploded in gunfire, every bullet lighting up the darkness like lightning ripping through a storm. Lorenzo moved with deadly precision, pulling Sofia behind a pillar as Matteo's men swarmed the cliffside. The sea crashed violently below, wind howling through the chaos. He reloaded, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Matteo's shadowed figure advancing through the fog of smoke and muzzle flashes. This wasn't just another fight for power. This was war for everything he'd lost, everything he'd dared to love again. Sofia crouched beside him, her breath ragged, clutching her weapon like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to courage. Her hands shook, but not from fear. From purpose. From rage. A car erupted in flames behind them as one of Lorenzo's shots hit a gas line. The explosion sent men flying, their screams drowned by the thunderous roar of fire and fury. Matteo laughed through it all, shouting that Lorenzo could never win. That love made him weak, predictable. But Lorenzo didn't flinch. He looked at Sofia, and in her eyes, he found something he hadn't felt in years, faith. Not fear, not pity, faith. And it fueled him like gasoline to flame. He moved first, sprinting from cover, firing as he went. Matteo's men fell one by one, the air thick with gunpowder and vengeance. Sofia followed, ducking and firing, her braid whipping behind her as she shouted his name, covering him with precise shots that took down those who tried to flank him. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting beside him, equal in fury and love. Matteo retreated toward his car, yelling for backup, but Lorenzo was faster. He caught him before he could reach the door, slamming him against the hood so hard it dented. Matteo grunted, sneering through blood, mocking Lorenzo for throwing away his empire over a girl. Lorenzo's voice was low, deadly calm as he said he wasn't throwing it away. He was reclaiming his soul. Matteo spat blood and laughed that it was too late, that the men still loyal to him would hunt them both down. Then Sofia stepped forward, her gun steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told Matteo his empire ended tonight. He turned, sneering, calling her nothing but property, but before he could finish, she fired. The bullet struck his leg, sending him to his knees. Lorenzo didn't stop her. She aimed again, this time at his shoulder, her voice breaking as she said no woman was property, not anymore. Matteo roared in pain, but Lorenzo grabbed his collar, dragged him to the edge of the cliff. The sea raged below, waves smashing against jagged rock. Lorenzo told him this was where his power ended, where every betrayal, every lie, every scar he'd caused finally found its price. Matteo gasped that Lorenzo wouldn't do it, that deep down he was still the same man who used to believe in mercy. Lorenzo's face hardened. He said mercy died the day Matteo touched her. He shoved him. Matteo fell, his screams swallowed by the crashing waves. Silence followed, a silence so thick it felt sacred. Sofia stood frozen, staring at the edge, the echo of gunfire fading into the night. Lorenzo turned to her, his chest heaving, blood streaking his arm. When he finally spoke, his voice broke the stillness. He told her it was over. For the first time in years, it was over. She walked to him, tears spilling down her cheeks, hands trembling as she touched his face. He caught her wrist, pressing it to his heart. It beat wildly beneath her palm. He whispered that she'd saved him, not from Matteo, not from the war, but from himself. She smiled through the tears, saying she didn't save him. He just finally remembered who he was. The fire burned out behind them, leaving smoke curling into the dawn. Police sirens wailed in the distance. They both knew they couldn't stay. Too many enemies would come once they heard Matteo was gone. But as Lorenzo looked at her, he realized for the first time, running didn't feel like losing. It felt like freedom. They drove until the sun climbed over the horizon, painting the road gold. The air was heavy with salt and blood and quiet promise. Lorenzo reached over, his fingers brushing hers on the gear shift. She squeezed back. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. Months later, word spread through the city. Matteo's empire was gone. His loyal men had turned themselves in or vanished. Lorenzo's old associates whispered that the ghost of the man once called Il Leone had disappeared into thin air. But those who knew better said he'd found something worth disappearing for. In a small coastal town far from the chaos, Sofia ran a little cafe by the sea. She laughed easily now, her scars hidden beneath sunlight and freedom. And sometimes, when the wind carried the faint sound of an engine pulling up the hill, her heart would skip. Lorenzo always came late, always quiet, wearing a simple shirt, eyes soft instead of hard. He'd sit by the counter, watch her pour coffee, and when no one was looking, he'd kiss her wrist the way he used to, right over the pulse that once trembled with fear. Now it pulsed with life. One evening, as the sun sank behind the water, he handed her a small velvet box. Her breath caught when she opened it, a simple silver ring. He said it wasn't about ownership or debt or redemption. It was about promise. She laughed, tears glimmering, saying he didn't have to ask. He smiled, his voice low, saying he already knew her answer. They stayed like that as the waves whispered below, the past drifting away with the tide. The mafia world they'd escaped still existed somewhere beyond the horizon, but it no longer owned them. They'd built something stronger than fear, sharper than vengeance. Love born from ashes, unbreakable and alive. When Lorenzo finally stood, he looked at the horizon and said quietly that Matteo was wrong about one thing. Love doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous to those who try to kill it. Sofia smiled, leaning into his side, and for the first time in forever, the world didn't feel like a trap. It felt like home. Sometimes love doesn't rescue you, it rebuilds you. Sofia and Lorenzo learned that redemption doesn't come from escape, but from choosing to live without fear. If you felt that rush, subscribe now. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Share this story with someone who loves intensity. And get ready. The next one will burn even hotter.